So without further ado, Professor McKelvey.
Thanks, Howard. Well, I have a presentation that I put together myself, but before that, I thought it would be useful for a transition from yesterday to show you this particular sequence of transparency of slides or PowerPoints, whatever, produced by a government agency in Washington, the Energy Information Administration, which is a technical group. And I think they do their best to be dispassionate and honest in what they present. It's not a political organization. These transparencies, the slides, are going to be showing you where we have been and where we are going in the next 20, 25 years, 20 years actually, to 2025, providing that nothing significantly changes from the past. They feed in what was going on and the trajectory that would lead to, unless there were some big change that wasn't anticipated or wouldn't come except with a small probability. Now, one thing they did not, this is about a year old, what they did not know was that in the middle of this year, suddenly there would be an energy crisis and the price of oil would double. And all of the things that go with that, in particular, that many of the alternative fuels, the renewables, became economically competitive because the price of oil had gone so high. And that doesn't figure into this. So this is the way it would have been had that not happened. So here we go. Let's see, or do we? I need to find something that I can't see, which is how I get to the next transparency. I think this is it. Okay, now this you see on the left is what has happened up to now. The line in the middle is now, more or less, a year or so back. And then what will happen on the right. This is worldwide, and they've divided the countries of the world into 3 groups. The mature markets, the red ones, that would include the EU, the United States, Japan, South Korea, all of the countries that have reached a state of economic maturity. The so-called transitional economies are, in fact, a little bit misnamed. They're the ones that aren't transitioning. They're the stable ones that are at the bottom of the heap. Whereas the emerging economies include countries like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, those countries that are beginning to industrialize from having been quite non-industrial in the past. And what you see is their claim that the consumption, total consumption of all kinds of energy will be rising a little bit for the mature economies, but rising a lot for those emerging economies between now and 20 years from now. Now, why is that happening? Well, if you look at the populations, it seems to be mostly driven by expanding populations of those emerging economies, because the mature market population is more or less constant, and the same is true of the third world and the so-called southern economies. So a lot of that increase is simply an increase in numbers. And that's somewhat borne out here because you see, again, the transitional ones are the ones in the middle, the pale blue, and their per capita consumption hasn't gone up very much according to this projection over the 20 years. So it must be that the numbers went up. And I'm not sure whether that means that those same countries have grown or whether other countries have entered the group that are beginning to emerge. I suspect it's a little bit of each. This shows the mix of consumption according to the types of fuel. And you will see that oil, during this whole period, was expected to stay way on top, natural gas and coal together some way down, renewables quite low and not growing all that fast, and nuclear on a worldwide scale actually pretty low. A small fraction was nuclear worldwide, and was expected to be over the next 20 years. Coal, here you see one of the big changes. China and India are singled out among the emerging countries, and you see if you follow going from the yellow on the left to the green on the right, those are successions in time from back to 1980 up to 2025, and you see they are the ones that are growing the fastest in their consumption of coal. Likewise, they are growing pretty fast in electricity consumption. So they are the ones that are changing the picture as it was conceived a couple of years ago. That was the view that went into the determination of what would be done in the Kyoto Accords as well. That was done back about 15 years ago now, and so their thoughts were somewhat along this line as to what was happening. They recognized there was a problem. There were countries that had not been using a lot of energy in the beginning, but were about to be using energy. And the question was, how do we treat those countries? And the decision that was made was that they would be excluded from the initial phase of the Kyoto Accords. That is, they would not be restricted because it wouldn't be appropriate to have them have the same proportion in the future they'd had in the past. That would simply crimp their growth. That was one of the bones of contention with the United States government, which felt that they should be included. So let's see, there's one more I think here. Yes, the carbon dioxide emissions, and you see that that's going up. Well, the yellow is the total, but look at the green, the emerging ones, that's going up. Ours is rising too, but the third world countries, it's pretty static and stable. So that's the end of that story. Let's see if I can get this out of here now. And I want to drop that down and pull up a set of transparencies on what has happened, Kyoto and since. The first thing that happened was the Framework Convention, which preceded the Kyoto Protocol, which in effect is part of the evolution of the Framework Convention. The United States signed on in 1993. It was in the early 90s that the countries of the world started worrying seriously about the effect of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases on the climate. But in the original form of the Framework Convention had a number of things in it, but the most important thing was that there was no requirements, no limitations on the effluents. It was all voluntary. By 1997, they realized that people were not responding to the voluntary concept, and so they tried to put in limits, controls. And the overall picture was that the total world emissions should drop down to the level in 1990. In fact, they wanted to get something like 7% below 1990. These emission levels are not low enough to keep the carbon dioxide constant. They are enough that the carbon dioxide is growing. So getting back to 1990 or even 5 or 7 or 10% below it would not stabilize. Nevertheless, they felt the first step would be to get back there. And it's an interesting story. The Kyoto Protocol almost didn't go through because the United States, this was the Clinton administration, at that time was opposed to doing anything unless there was this so-called cap and trade system incorporated in it. Now, a cap system means that each country has a limit imposed on the effluents that they are supposed to be allowed to produce. And the trade idea is that in order to hold down the carbon dioxide emission levels at the lowest cost, someone who has an obligation to drop his level could do it by finding someone else who isn't using his total and making a deal with that party. That's where the trade comes in. So typically you would have a country like the United States or one of the European countries discovering that they were pushing up against the limit. They would not want to exceed the limit because there would be penalties, cost penalties, for doing that. And so they'd look around to find a country that was below. Well, typically the third world countries would be below, and they would have the means of reducing CO2 emissions or actually sucking up CO2 that was already in the air. It's called growing a forest, or planting vegetation of any sort. And typically that was the way it would be done. And by putting the trade part along with the cap, it made it possible to essentially make the value of the right to emit a certain amount of carbon dioxide a quantity with a value. You could buy and sell these emission rights. And it would be good for the developed countries. They wouldn't hit the top. They wouldn't have to damage their economies by paying penalties. It would be good for the third world countries because they would bargain for how much they would charge for those emission rights that they would hand over to or take care of for the developed countries. Cap and trade system is something that we do in the United States already for sulfur dioxide. It's a concept that took decades to be accepted. When I first came up here to Missoula, I talked about it back in the 70s, and all the environmentalists were scandalized because they called it a license to pollute. And in a sense it is, but more fundamentally, it's a way to achieve these desirable changes at least cost to human society. So the protocol was held in abeyance until finally these other countries agreed to go along with Gore, who was the representative of the US there. And it's rather ironic then that the Europeans have embraced the idea and are using it now. And in 2001, Bush actually rejected the protocol, so we aren't involved at all. The next thing that came along was an attempt, in this country at least, the next thing that came along was an attempt to pass a bill in Congress to get around Bush's rejection of the protocol, and that was the McCain-Lieberman bill. That bill asserted that the US would, if it had passed, not get down to the 1990 levels or something around there or below there, but at least get back to the 2000 levels by 2010. That bill failed. I think they got 40% or so voted for it at that time in 2003. The argument that was made on the part of people who voted against the bill, including our junior senator, was that it would damage the US economy. I looked at the letter that Senator Burns sent me back at that time, and he said, well, you know, the price of power would go up by 7%, and our economy couldn't stand that. And of course, the price of oil has doubled, and even without this in there. So our economy has not totally tanked by a doubling, and so the idea that it would have with only a 7% increase seems a bit disingenuous at the present time. Anyhow, at that point, nothing was going on in the States. We were outside the game. The Europeans, Japan, other countries were playing the game of trying reductions jointly. The US was not. In 2004, the U.S. Senate did accept the idea that human activities did cause climate change. It's quite remarkable that this passed in the U.S. Senate just a year later. However, that didn't mean they were going to pass the McCain-Lieberman bill. Notice they said this is the case, that the human activities cause greenhouse gases, cause climate change, and therefore Congress should enact a national program of mandatory market-based limits. Now, market-based means, in this case, what I was describing. If you have a transfer system, then there'll be a negotiation between the country that needs a credit for emission and the country that has an extra credit for emission. And in that negotiation, a price is set. So the market is doing it, and this makes it automatic and decentralized, and that's a desirable thing to happen, because then the market automatically will find the cheapest sources of energy and minimize the costs. So they said they'd do that, but they had these provisos. One was the proviso that the U.S. economy not be harmed, and you heard from Burns what he thought of that with respect to the McCain-Feingold-Lieberman bill. And then this question of other major emitters be in there. And China and India were not in there. They were excluded by choice of the group of countries that were in there, because they were in this transitional state, and to hold them to a fixed percentage of what they were doing at the beginning would have made it impossible for them to progress. The argument was not settled, but the U.S. remained outside the game. What happened next that's important, I think, is the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which was signed by President Bush in just about a month and a half ago, I think, down at Sandia in New Mexico. And this was an overall bill to deal with our energy situation, the shortages that we're developing, what to do about it to make sure that we had a degree of independence and so on. And the major provisions, all of them are aimed at dealing with the fossil fuels. The first one, this so-called practical reforms to the permitting process. That means simplifying the permitting process and limiting the requirements so that there would be an expansion in oil and natural gas production. For gas pipelines, tax incentives. For liquid natural gas, the clarification was to make it easier for them to import liquid natural gas with fewer restrictions. This partnership on nuclear power was a federal subsidy for nuclear power plants to get them started, because, as Jack Kroschauer pointed out yesterday, nuclear plants are very expensive to start up. And also they had a risk insurance, so that if anything went wrong in those nuclear plants, the feds would essentially cover the cost of a meltdown, for example, if that happened. They also put well over $1 billion into looking into oil shale and tar sands. So these are all fossil fuels. They did also some token things with respect to the renewables, but largely token. What did they leave out? Well, that sense of the Senate resolution that I showed you didn't get in there. It didn't get past the conference. It omitted any kind of caps, of emission caps. For example, Senator Bingaman from New Mexico had a bill in which was less demanding than McCain-Lieberman. None of those bills came in. There are no required caps at all in the bill. And another thing that happened was that they made it easier for companies to go in and extract coal bed methane by eliminating the protection that was present through the EPA on and the the Water Conservation Act, the way they get to the coal bed methane is by cracking rock structures underground, and this can cause contamination of waters, and particularly of drinking waters. There was a requirement that they not do that if it was going to damage drinking water. That requirement has been eliminated in the bill. Those are emissions. I should have here some additions, but I guess they're the one before, that's all. Okay, at this point, or actually a little before this, Tony Blair, as I have it here, took the offensive. Tony Blair has favored cap and trade emissions controls from the beginning. And there's a reason for it, and it's a basic principle of resource economics. It is that emissions of carbon dioxide constitute what you would call, what they call a public good. That is a public quantity. They also call it a public bad because it's an undesirable quantity. And that is to say, if anybody produces an emission of carbon dioxide anywhere in the world, that affects the whole world. It affects everybody, therefore it's public. And one of the problems with public goods is that you can get people, when you try to control them, you have individuals or countries that can play the role of free riders. If a group of countries reduce their emissions and these others stay outside the system, they get a free ride. They're better off because of what the others did. And the US has been a free rider in the Kyoto protocols from the beginning. So one thing was that you try to deal with that problem, and therefore, with a public good, you have to have some system which is worldwide that involves all the polluters, or at least the major ones. So Tony Blair in Davos at this so-called World Summit made a speech, the keynote speech of the convention, in which he pointed out that in the last half of the year, Britain would be the lead organization both in the EU and in the G8, this industrial countries, the G8, and that he intended to use his time there as the leader of those two organizations to press for two things. One was poverty in Africa. This is tied in with the so-called millennial goals of the UN, which all countries in the world agreed to, which was if every country gave 0.7% of its gross national product to dealing with very basic things like childhood education, food, health, and things of that sort, the idea was they'd be able to cut poverty in half by what year?
2015.
2020, is it?
2015.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The other thing he said he was going to deal with was global climate change. And these things are not mutually contradictory. In fact, dealing with climate change is one of the things you have to do to take care of some of the poor countries in the world. For example, areas that are desertifying, becoming desert in Africa. And so he moved quickly. He had a very large scientific conference at Exeter in Britain in February. Actually, I was near there. I was walking in Exeter in the park. That's the place where the Hound of the Baskerville was, you know. I didn't get to the scientific conference. I wasn't invited, in fact. But at that conference, they were trying to answer the question, how much climate change is acceptable to the world? Now, last week when Steve Running was here, he said that the scientists drew back from that because this is too vague a concept because some places gain, some places lose, and they didn't want to set a limit. The idea was 2 degrees centigrade change in the world climate, some people were saying, would be the place that you should not, that would be the red line you didn't want to cross. The politicians need a red line, so there's a goal as to what to do. The scientists didn't accommodate them with that. He then, when finally the EU came into authority in the middle of the year. First of all, things went well with the EU. They are involved in the cap and trade system, but he had to deal with the G8, and so he invited to the G8 meeting those other countries that were emerging because he recognized that they had to be in on the discussions. Well, but then George Bush decided to react. And so what he did was he did the same thing he did in Iraq. He set up a coalition of the willing against the Kyoto group. He proposed a bloc with these countries listed: China, Japan, India, South Korea, and Australia. They call it, therefore, the Asia-Pacific bloc. These countries are very important. They are producing about half the total greenhouse gases. And they didn't have a meeting yet, but they talked in a preliminary way of the things they would do to deal with climate change. And it was totally the technological fix, new technology, and nothing about restrictions in the form of these caps. In fact, just recently, the Australian government, including John Howard and the foreign minister, talked derisively of any talk of negotiating emission levels. They said it was a waste of time. Japan, which is doing its best to meet its emission levels, countered by saying that all countries should be bound by the Framework Convention, but that's not the same as saying that they would accept mandatory emission levels, so it's not clear where they were coming. Now, there's a meeting. All of this is leading up to a big meeting, the Framework Convention meeting, which starts on the 28th of this month in Montreal. And it's supposed to be the big meeting since the beginning of the Kyoto Protocols, the meeting at which the decisions are made about the second stage of Kyoto, when they really get down to business and impose tight caps. But it appeared that Bush had, to a degree, trumped Blair here, and so the G8 could only conclude this last line. Well, they weren't really going to try to set the caps at that meeting, but they were going to try to get all these countries involved. The first stage would be that they should all be talking together. Tony Blair gave a speech back then, which I want to quote to you because I think it's a very important statement of where he was and what he's trying to accomplish. And well, you can decide then if I've got it. It better be here. Oh, here it is. It's titled Get Real on Climate Change, and it's a speech he gave. Actually, it wasn't a speech, it was an article in the Observer newspaper in London, October 31st. So it's essentially his point of view going into that G8 conference. Let me read what he said, and the main points will be up here. He said, I believe, says Tony Blair, that the basic difficulties with the current climate change debate between Britain and the United States, if you like, and their various adherents, lies in a reluctance to face up to reality and to take the practical action needed to tackle the issues. We know that climate change is a major threat, and worries over security of energy supply and rising oil prices are pushing energy policy to the top of the agenda. But we must understand that neither issue can realistically be dealt with unless the US, the EU, Russia, Japan, China, and India work together. That is, they all have to enter into the debate at the Framework Convention. We also have to recognize that while the Kyoto Protocol takes us in the right direction, it alone is not enough. We need to cut greenhouse gas emissions radically, but Kyoto doesn't even stabilize them. That is correct about the first phase of Kyoto. He says, it won't work either. It won't work either as intended unless the U.S. is a part of it. And he adds, it's easy to take frustrations out on the Bush administration, but people forget that the Senate voted 95-0 against the Kyoto Treaty when Bill Clinton was in the White House. He couldn't get it through the Senate. Nobody voted in favor of it. So the problem isn't just Bush. Furthermore, even if the U.S. did sign up to Kyoto, that would not affect the huge growth in energy consumption we will see in India and China. China is building close to 1 new power station every week. 1 a week. They need economic growth to lift hundreds of millions out of poverty. You know that China has as many people as the US and the EU put together. So does India. These people need economic growth to lift hundreds of millions out of poverty, but they want to grow sustainably, and we have to give them help. The first Kyoto commitment period ends in 2012. The challenge is, what will come next? We must look beyond 2012. This is the purpose of the UN process starting in Montreal on November 28th. Whatever doubts and frustrations there might be about Kyoto and the difficulties ahead, Montreal is significant as it is the only forum in which formal negotiations on future international commitments take place. All the rest is talk. The negotiations have to be there. There are huge opportunities, he says, in environmental technology and huge possibilities in sustainable development if the right legally binding framework for low carbon energy generation can be found. He's talking about the successor to the Kyoto protocols. Climate change will only be addressed through both technological development and a robust, inclusive, and binding international treaty. I have it on the board here. And we are working hard to achieve both. But we cannot succeed unless the major developed and emerging nations sit down together and work it out in a way that allows us all to grow, imposes no competitive disadvantage, and enables the transfer of the technology needed for sustainable growth to take place. In other words, there's a fairness principle involved here, because with any kind of a cap and trade system, there is an initial allocation of emission quantities. And how that is done is there's no principle behind it. In other contexts, they just say, well, go with the historical precedent. For example, I work with marine fisheries, and there when we have a regional agreement among countries to cut back on harvest, the typical thing they'll do, because it's the simplest thing to do, is say, well, we'll cut you back, but in proportion to what you were doing before. If that were done here, and those countries like China and India were incorporated in the process, this would cut them off from growth. On the other hand, if you include them and put a limit as to where they will be, then that gives a special advantage to all of us in the West who've been polluting the air with carbon dioxide for a couple of centuries. So how do you find fairness in this? And fairness is in the eye of the beholder, and this is one big problem in coming to terms on anything like that. Well, this, he says, is the scale of the challenge, but, he says, the mood is also changing. Things are looking up, he's saying. The scientific evidence is becoming more certain. Vicious climate disasters heighten public concerns. He's talking about the hurricanes and the probability that those hurricanes are related to climate change. In the U.S., many states and many in industry want to act, and that is, they're going around the federal government. We mentioned last time that California is setting limits on automobile gasoline consumption. A number of other states are signing on to that, maybe enough that these things will actually happen without the federal government. And the same is true of many businesses, including some big energy companies. They are trying to do something. Many of those are international companies, multilateral companies, and they have to conform to the EU requirements when they operate in Britain. So it isn't the U.S. driving this process globally, it's other countries. So, well, I'll skip a little of that. So he says, this year has seen unprecedented attention given to climate change. Back in February, it was a big topic. It's becoming one again. Through the G8 dialogue, that was just last week, and the UN meeting in Montreal late this month, we are starting, says Tony, to build the foundation of the genuinely global response that we need. I hope he's right. I hope that's happening. Well, I have one last transparency here. This is the way I see it. I think Blair's view, as expressed in this article, is essentially right. That frames the political context, and it's an international, it's a worldwide context in which we have to imagine the changes going forward. And I also think that something like a cap-and-trade system is essential because of the fact that the basic economic facts about public goods. So this is necessary, and the allocations have to be enforced or it's meaningless, but those initial allocations have to be negotiated, and all parties must accept them as being fair. Second point is that the other parties who talk about technological fixes, certainly these are coming. These are in the future, but we really don't know what they will be, and they aren't going to come quickly. They are going to take decades. And so in dealing with the next 20 years, we have to look to short-term, one-time solutions through such things as efficiency. That means conservation in the sense of doing the things we do now more efficiently, like heating houses with less energy, like using the new light bulbs that instead of having a little wire that burns, are fluorescent. Things of that sort, we'd be doing the same kinds of things. So these are efficiency changes. They differ from the other kinds of conservation that involve major changes in the way society functions. And then by renewables. But I think that in this short run even, efficiency enhancements and renewable technologies aren't going to be enough, and that we are going to have to do something more, and especially in the longer run, we're going to have to look beyond the easy ways out. And that may mean major changes in the way we run our world, and it may also mean using nuclear power in a way that many people will find to be unsettling. So that's mine. And Dave Merrill is going to come up and describe some success stories. Thank you. There you go.
Good evening. My name is David Merrill. Can you hear me in the back? And I'm the director of a national network of 35 groups and individual supporters called globalwarmingsolution.org. So just to let you know, I am not going to be using PowerPoint except later in my presentation just for one slide. I want to show you some charts, but I had prepared just a standard talk. So a few things you may not know about global warming, I think that are very important to keep in mind. 75% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere destabilizing the Earth's climate are from the wealthy countries and emitted over the past 100 to 200 years. They are not from China. President Bush and a lot of national leaders love to talk about China. But frankly, the reason that we're in the situation that we're in today is because of the emissions from the wealthy countries. And it's a basic principle that we learned as children. If you make a mess, you need to get started on cleaning it up. And that was one of the basic principles of the whole Kyoto UN process. Hearing about Tony Blair, I have to laugh. We're going through this whole big process about how we need to talk about getting China and India involved with the United States. That was all done in the 1990s. There's a book called The Carbon War, which I highly recommend. It talks about the lost decade. The lost decade started in 1990. And that was when the international scientific consensus was that greenhouse gases were causing destabilization of the atmosphere. They recommended cutting greenhouse gases 60 to 80%, CO2, 60 to 80%. This was in 1990. And then all through the 1990s, countries from around the world were coming together at international meetings, spending a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears trying to get an international treaty agreed upon. One of the problems with an international treaty, one of the constant challenges, is that it is very hard to get sovereign states to agree on anything, let alone something that has profound social, economic, and environmental impact. So all these countries were coming together, struggling to come up with a decent international agreement. And right in the middle of it, the best prepared, largest delegation was from the United States, orchestrating incredible obfuscation of the proceedings, working with OPEC, interfering with meetings, trying to water everything down, denying the science. I mean, you read it and it makes your blood boil. That's the context. And all these issues of China and India were exhaustively broached in the 1990s. And the basic position was, the problem comes from the wealthy countries. They should get started on reducing their emissions, making a commitment. And then, in later phases, countries like China and India would be brought in. Obviously, their economies are growing rapidly. They need to be involved in any long-term agreement. But the basic morality is, countries like the United States should get started. And the tragedy is that we're not involved. And so I think Tony Blair should have taken his energy and used all of that time to criticize the United States, rather than talking about this new plan, which we already agreed on in the 1990s. Another thing that's important to keep in mind about global warming. Already, 160,000 people a year are dying from climate change, according to the World Health Organization. Most of these people are women and children in developing countries, especially Africa. And there's growing lines of modeling evidence showing that the strange weather that's occurring in Africa is related to the warming of the Indian Ocean, which is related to human-produced greenhouse gas emissions. 80% of the people that live in Africa are involved in subsistence or semi-subsistence agriculture. These people cannot take even one drought. 2 droughts, historic droughts, people start dying. And I came across this earlier this year because I monitor these news events from around the world. Very often I'll read about the droughts in the American West, read stories about that. I came across an article from Kenya, and they were talking about the rains being light this year. And then there was this phrase that really struck me. So thousands of Kenyans are faced with starvation. They start dying. 160,000 a year. This is already happening to people. It's already a very, very immediate thing. The BBC went to one of the areas of the world that's in the gun sights of global warming. And this is the Ganges Delta in Bangladesh. And they interviewed people that are living in areas where the sea level is very close to the level of the land. It's one of the most fertile areas in the world. Lots of poor people. And they went around and talked about climate change. And they found that these people are very angry. I have some quotations from the article. Now, let's talk about their greenhouse gas emissions first. Typical family there. They live in a hut. They have a stove made out of clay. They burn a little bit of wood for their food. They're involved in very intensive, obviously labor-intensive agriculture and fishing. Their boats are paddled by oars. In other words, they produce almost no greenhouse gases. We are angry with the people who are doing this, said Abdul Razak. We are angry with the people building these factories that will make us sink into the sea. What can we do? Asked their neighbor, Abdus Salam Talukadar. We are angry, but we're trying to get on with our lives. We can do nothing, but everyone is angry. The third thing I'd like you to keep in mind is with all these struggle by the developed countries to come to a treaty, going home, getting it ratified, dealing with all this major energy at home, all of the reductions from the developed countries are going to be completely eliminated because of one nation, our own. Everything that Britain, Canada, all these countries, all these wealthy countries that are working hard to reduce their emissions, it's all slated to be wiped out in the first round just because the United States is not participating. So those are a few things just to kind of set the moral context. Now tonight I'm going to talk about, I'm going to show you the proposal that we have to address global climate change, which is extraordinarily aggressive, as you'll see. Before we do that, I'd like to kind of set the stage on the size of the renewable energy resource that we have at our disposal. I'll give you a few examples. Take a 100-mile by 100-mile area of the Nevada desert, cover it with solar panels. Just picture this one little block, and you would produce enough electricity to power the entire United States. The wind energy in 4 states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, and Texas, can produce enough power for the entire energy needs of the United States. That's just 4 states. Every state in the United States has one of the 4 principal renewable energy resources in abundance. The 4 are sun, wind, biomass, and geothermal. So every state in the United States has at least one in abundance. Some have all 4. It's everywhere. And the amount of energy is amazing. Now that's just the gross resource. It's almost a spiritual concept. It's all this stuff out there that we can get that's completely renewable. State of the technology is the second thing I'd like you to think about. Perfect example, hybrids. Toyota Prius, the leading manufacturer of hybrid technology. My mother was thinking about buying a hybrid, so when I was home this summer, we drove these cars, kind of comparing. They're very, I think some of you have probably driven them or maybe even owned them. It's a very highly developed technology, over 50 miles per gallon. They can't make them fast enough. I mean, we went in, they didn't have any. They just had the test car that we could drive. There's a waiting list. In some parts of the country, people are paying a premium. Now, Toyota, a few years ago, looked at this technology, developed it, and decided they wanted to get market share, so they sold the car for less than the cost of production, which encouraged people to get in, start driving the cars, saving the gas, telling their neighbors. They kept developing the technology, and now they can't make them fast enough, and the technology is the market leader. There's other companies are actually licensing Toyota technology. The CEO of Toyota recently said that he wanted to address the price gap between a comparable sedan and the Prius. And so he's instructed his executive staff to come up with a way to cut that in half. very important. For example, in my mother's case, she drives a Toyota Corolla, which is about a $15,000 car. Toyota Prius is 21, 22, I believe, if somebody knows a more current figure. And so there is that disadvantage, even though you make up a lot of it with fuel economy. So Toyota plans to cut that difference in half, and they'll sell even more. I just heard today that GM is in increasing danger of going bankrupt. And one of the reasons is they didn't see this coming. Sound familiar? It happened many years ago with fuel efficiency with Japan as well. Okay, so that's one thing, vehicles. Another thing to keep in mind, wind turbines. They are now operating off Germany, offshore, 5-megawatt wind turbines. These are enormous. This one turbine produces power for 4,500 homes. One windmill. Okay? This is not speculative. They're online producing power as we speak. Wind industry officials have said that they're planning to build 10-megawatt wind turbines in the relatively near future. So that'll be one turbine producing enough electricity for 9,000 homes. Solar power. It's the solar industry, solar photovoltaics, which is producing electricity from sunlight, has been growing at 60% a year for the past 4 years. In fact, in the United States, there's a shortage. It's very difficult to get solar panels because so many people want them and because a lot more incentives are being offered, especially in California. I called Lee from Solar Plexus today to see how business was going. I invited him to come tonight, but he was too busy. He said that they're very busy. They're selling a lot of PV panels. They're selling a lot of micro hydro, which is very surprising to him. And they're also, he said, the big thing coming on now is solar hot water. And people are not only using that for showers and other hot water needs, but they're also using it for space heating. Right here in cloudy western Montana. A couple of things that you may be interested in terms of solar panels that you may want to watch. One is to watch the efficiency of the conversion of sunlight to electricity. All over the world now, there's major investments, research labs, governments involved, a lot of scientific enterprise trying to improve the efficiency of solar cells. The industry standard is about 14 or 15%. Some companies are actually selling panels that are 20% efficient. So one of the things that they're developing is they're trying to push the efficiency. And every time you do that, it means you get electricity for a lower cost. One of the things I came across a couple weeks ago that was kind of interesting, don't know how much that's going to be. There's these 2 solar companies in China that have been doing research, and they just merged, and they said in the press conference that they're coming up with a new solar cell. It's called thermophotovoltaics. It creates the ability to get electrons to move not only from the light, but from the heat. And they also said they're pretty confident that they're going to come out with a cell that's 35% efficient. Now, when that happens, that market, which is already mushrooming, is just going to explode. And you'll be able to put solar, people will be buying solar panels, you know, to put on tops of parking lots, and everybody will be trying to maximize their solar power. All this is coming on very quickly. Another aspect of solar technology that you should keep an eye on is solar panels that are made out of plastics. Solar panels are generally made from silicon right now, which is one of the most abundant elements in the Earth's crust. It's pretty expensive, and it's a very involved process to produce the raw silicon. It's also a bottleneck now in the production. It's one of the things they want to be making more panels, but there's a bottleneck in terms of silicon, and they compete with the computer industry for the stock. So one of the things that's being worked on right now is to have solar panels that are made out of plastic. And they just had a breakthrough a month ago. They got 4 or 5% efficiency from plastic solar cells. And the researchers said their goal is to produce a solar panel that has the same efficiency as the ones today, and they want to produce it for 10% of the cost. All these things are moving, and solar is a very, very bright spot. So I want to encourage you in terms of the technology. Now, a couple things to keep in mind in terms of what's already happening in terms of countries, in terms of the power they're getting. Let's look at the example of Brazil. Very interesting case. 1978, 85% of the energy used in Brazil came from oil imports. And they got blasted in the energy crises of the 1970s. And so they got together and they said, this can't happen again. We want to get off this dependence on oil imports. What they did is they began aggressively developing, it's called bagasse. It's ethanol made from sugarcane residue. By 2002, they had reduced their oil imports to 10%. This year, the government announced they expect their oil imports to go to zero. 20% of the cars in Brazil run on 100% ethanol. Again, produced from sugarcane residue. How did they get there? They said, you want to sell cars to Brazilians? This was back in the 1970s. Make them run on higher percentages of ethanol. And they did. It's very much to the credit of the manufacturers. They resisted, they fought, but the Brazilians didn't budge. They demanded, they knew it was technologically possible. And to the credit of the businesses, they figured out how to do it. And now they're reaping the benefits. Denmark currently gets 22% of its electricity from wind. A province in northern Germany gets 29%. I heard a talk from one of the environmental officials in Denmark and said that they're moving to get 40% of their electricity from wind. A booming industry, and they're exporting turbines all over the world, including the United States. Germany, we're going to talk more about Germany later tonight. They currently get 33% of their electricity from nuclear power. They're phasing out all their nuclear power plants. When they reach their 32nd birthday, they're shut down. The first one has already been shut down. They'll all be completely shut down by 2020. If something exists, it must be possible. That's how I'd like to end that section. Okay, so our organization was formed in the fall of 2003, and it's a network of 35 grassroots organizations all over the country. And all of the groups and individuals that have joined the organization endorse what we call the 3 R's of a global warming solution. The 3 R's are to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. The second is to redirect the multi-billion-dollar federal subsidies from fossil fuels to nuclear power to renewable energy. Every year, we're spending billions of dollars to subsidize dirty energy industries that are at a mature stage of development. That needs to stop. Germany is completely phasing theirs out. We should do the same. The third R is to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions 80% below 1990 levels by 2020. And that, by far, is the most unique part of what we're advocating. In fact, we've had groups that we've tried to recruit that said, we think that's impossible, so we can't join. So we're going to show tonight some of the rationale for that and how we think we can get there and why we think it's needed. Okay, why do we think it's needed? Well, the scientific community said, as I mentioned earlier, in 1990, that human activity is increasing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And they said, you need to cut 60 to 80% carbon dioxide emissions globally immediately. So when we designed our policy goals, we wanted to faithfully represent what the scientists were saying, no matter how difficult it seemed it would be to fulfill that urgency. And an analogy I would give you is, say you're crossing a boat, you're crossing a lake at night on a ferry, you get 1.5 miles out, there's an explosion in the engine room, and the ship starts sinking immediately. No time to find a life preserver. You can't get into a lifeboat. You're on the deck. It's pitching beneath your feet. You have a choice. You stay with the boat and drown, or you swim 1.5 miles. But the furthest you've ever swam is 1 mile. What do? You try to swim 1.5 miles. And it's our belief that that's where the world is now. We're 1.5 miles from shore, and we don't think we can get to shore, but that's the only hope that we have. So we're going to have to outdo ourselves. Now, one of the things you're hearing more of lately is that this problem is so far advanced, impacts are becoming so severe, let's just focus on adaptation. That's a little bit like telling a severe alcoholic not to stop drinking and just deal with the impact of his drunkenness. First thing that the drunken person needs to do is to stop drinking. And the first thing that we need to do in terms of fossil fuel emissions is to cut them as radically as possible. And also prepare for the inevitable adaptation that will be required to make. Global temperatures have risen over the past century about 1 degree Fahrenheit, or about 0.6 degrees centigrade. Now, a lot of the international goals in terms of addressing greenhouse gas emissions is to try to keep the increase above pre-industrial levels to about 2 degrees centigrade. In other words, about 3 times the rise that we've already had in the past century. But it's our belief that 0.6 degrees centigrade, or 1 degree Fahrenheit, is not an environmentally viable condition. Where we are now is clearly not a stable situation, and it's getting worse. The impacts are growing severe, and far more severe, and some positive feedbacks may be kicking in. The most prominent has been in the news recently, and most of you have heard of this, and that's what's going on in the Arctic. The Arctic ice sheet is about 40% thinner than it was half a century ago. And for the past 4 years, they take the summer ice reading in September. And that's where they get the full extent of the summer ice retreat. And for the past 4 years, including September 2005, the ice pack in the Arctic was smaller each year. And they feel that this is a positive feedback, that basically the things that are happening are feeding on themselves. Ice is the most effective reflector of sunlight. Open water is one of the most effective absorbents of sunlight. And so it's obvious why that may be taking off. So in that kind of situation, we feel that we need to be working as hard as we can. There's another psychological reason for that as well. I think it's a lot more interesting, it's a lot more motivating and exciting to be aiming for a very ambitious goal in the face of a very serious problem. I think there's a lot of psychological benefits that you get from doing that, rather than taking a more passive, resigned approach. And it's just more exciting, especially when you're talking about renewable energy. It's just so much more inherently appealing than fossil fuels. Okay. So, now one other thing you need to keep in mind about the world situation, and Bob alluded to this earlier, China gets about 75% of its energy from coal. Over the course of the next 10 years, 1,200 coal plants are slated to come online around the world, mostly in China, India, and the United States. That can't happen. There's no way the atmosphere can take 1,200 more coal plants. So how could that possibly be averted? The only way that we have thought of that could be averted is to so change the economics of renewable energy that power planners in the United States, China, and India would be thrown out of their jobs if they sited another coal plant. And the only way that'll happen is if we bring the cost of photovoltaic panels and wind energy down so it's so low that that will be the economically viable alternative. And that's one of the purposes of government action, is to address the disparity. I'll give you a good example here in the state of Montana. There's a coal plant planned for the Billings area by the Bull Mountain Coal Company. And we were looking at this, okay, they're going to build a coal plant, and there actually is pretty good wind resources there, very good solar resources. And so we thought, well, Why don't they just put in wind turbines there? So we called Pat Judge from Montana Environmental Information Center and asked him how much would it cost to site turbines there instead of the coal plant. It costs about twice as much. So we need government policies, especially at the federal level, so that when Governor Schweitzer and the state of Montana looks at situations like that, it becomes more economically viable to cite renewable technologies. There is no way that that amount of money can be addressed by the state of Montana alone. It's a classic backyard case of the need for a unified national strategy. Okay, so let me show you our proposal here in terms of the energy mix. That's the energy mix in the United States right now. 86% fossil fuels, 11% nuclear and hydro, biomass 3%, and 1% from geo, solar, and wind. And our policy goal is this mix in 15 years. 27% fossil fuels, that's coal, oil, and natural gas. Nuclear and hydro would be stable. This is a vision that calls for no new nuclear plants and no new coal plants or gas. So nuclear and hydro would be stable. Wind would provide 19% of our power. Solar photovoltaic, 6%. Solar thermal, which is using the heated water for hot water needs and space heating, 5%. 16% for biomass, 2% for geothermal, and 8% for lifestyle changes. This is the personal things that people can do to reduce their energy impact. Now, remember, this is a very radically different picture from what we have now, but we're not talking about 80% reductions in economic activity. We're talking about an 80% decarbonization of our energy system, which is a dramatically different picture. Okay, so some questions come up about this, obviously. Capital investment. I mean, to do this, to bring on all these technologies at such an aggressive pace, is obviously going to involve a lot of investment. Germany, which has the most aggressive renewable energy program in the world, is moving towards 100% renewable energy. But it's not a national mobilization. It's a very aggressive program, but it's not a war-level mobilization. They're doing it with investing only 0.14% of their GDP. 0.14%, and that has put them in 10 years from having almost no renewable resources to being the world leader. Okay, 0.14%. For comparison, the US spends about 4.5% of its GDP on the military right now in the United States. So, in terms of for getting a war-level mobilization in the United States, you'd have to be having a lot of investment. Most of the investment would be private investment, and these are very profitable industries. We're talking about energy. You think telecommunications and computers are a big industry, it's dwarfed by the energy industry. This is one of the hottest industrial sectors in the world. And so we're saying, come up with some government tools that would make this a very, very aggressive mobilization. And we think that this can be done for 5% of GDP. We're working on this paper that we're going to be releasing probably in January that's dealing with these questions. Some people say, so where are you going to get, where is that all going to come from? Well, any public money that needs to be involved. I mean, we just had a tax cut from President Bush that totaled about $2 trillion over 10 years. We have the money. There's no question about it. It's not a question of having enough money to invest. Some things that all need to happen over the next 15 years. The average motor vehicle in the United States turns over in about 15 years. That needs to happen much more aggressively. And there's very simple ways to do that. I think the most straightforward way, I mean, CAFE standards is one way to go. Another way could be a gas guzzler tax. If you want to buy a gas guzzler, there's a premium that you pay for that, and then you take that premium and you give it to the people that are buying fuel-efficient vehicles. It's a very efficient way of turning over the vehicle stock more rapidly. We need to develop a national high-speed rail system. Ralph Nader blew up once because he got so tired of hearing about how rail is so inefficient, requires government subsidies, forgetting that auto and aviation is very heavily subsidized in the United States, subsidized. And he said, go out to an interstate around a major city during rush hour and look at all those cars with one person in them. That's not very efficient either. We need a high-speed rail system. I mean, I've had a personal thing about trains. I think most people really like trains. There's something intrinsically appealing about them. We actually have a gentleman born in France here tonight, Raphael, and I spent 5 weeks in France, and public transit over there is unbelievable. You know, and it's more than that. It's more than efficient public transit. The average person in a country like France is just treated better. I mean, I went into Chicago once on Amtrak, and I was all excited about coming into Chicago. I was changing trains, and I was going to go to Union Station, get a piece of pizza, sit on one of those wooden benches, Union Station, and just enjoy the American train experience. And if you can believe this, I walked in, I got my pizza, I went over, I sat down like, here I am, Union Station. 2 minutes later, a police officer comes up with a huge revolver on his pistol, and he's not friendly. He said, you're going to have to move. And I said, what? I'm just sitting here eating my dinner. He said, I'm sorry, but a corporation has rented this for their happy hour, and you're going to have to get up and move. I mean, this is Union Station, and they're renting out Union Station, Chicago for a corporation's happy hour. I sprinted upstairs to the Amtrak office and threatened them with letters and everything. I don't know. Anyway, so that was my experience. Now, in France, flew into London, took a train down to the coast because I was going to take a hovercraft. Some of you may have done this. They have these enormous hovercrafts sitting on the beach. They're actually red, white, and blue. Sitting there, and these dozens and dozens of cars going on board. You get on, you go across the English Channel, 40 miles an hour. I mean, it's just, they're asking you if you want drinks. Everything is just nice for the average person. Got to the coast of France, took a train into Paris. You get out this gorgeous train station. I mean, it's just beautiful, bustling. It's beautiful architecture. Everything's working. And then you get on to TGV, which is the Train Grande Vitesse, 160 miles an hour. And you go up to these things, you come around the corner, and it's this huge orange snake. It's just so impressive. You get on there, and people are coming around and asking if you want food and drinks, and you're just an average person. So there's a cultural thing that's going on too, and I think that we need to take care of the average person. Okay, so we need a high-speed rail system in the United States, and there would be massive public support. Actually, a real tragedy has happened in the past, I think it happened in the past week or so. David Gunn, who is one of the top train executives in the United States, was forced out of Amtrak. And basically he said they just want to destroy the rail system. And this guy has done so many good things with the Washington subway, I think the New York subway, one of the most talented people in the country, totally committed to rail transit, and he's been forced out. So that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody when you consider the national leadership. Canada. It's very interesting to monitor the news articles because you get a sense of the politics in countries that are actually trying to address global warming, that actually have ratified Kyoto. They are struggling to meet their targets. You wouldn't believe the conversations they're having in Canada about this. They're trying so hard because they have to cut and they feel like they're behind. And they're passing really aggressive reforms. One of the big things in terms of their greenhouse gas reduction plan is they've come out with a massive new program so that people can retrofit their homes to make them more energy efficient. And it's roughly about $630 that goes towards the government to the average home for home retrofit. You know, windows, all kinds of leaking, insulation. They're committed, and it's really unbelievable that they're just so close, and it's just so different right across the border. Okay, let's talk about Germany. How are we doing on time here? Oh, we're kind of running out here. All right, let me finish up and tell you about Germany, and that should just about wrap it up, and then we can do the rest. Okay. German, as I said, the most aggressive renewable energy program in the world. They are on target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2020, and that's without a national mobilization. They've created 45,000 new jobs in the wind industry. That's going to be 100,000 new jobs by 2010. There's about 35,000 new jobs in photovoltaics. Their energy efficiency sector is booming. A lot of times when you come up with very aggressive energy efficiency legislation, new businesses have to start up, and they're going to become the world experts along with the Japanese, and they're already selling their services internationally. A lot of construction jobs have either been conserved or created. A lot of energy efficiency work, especially for buildings, is very, very labor intensive. Told you about the nuclear reactors. They're going to be phased out. That was largely ethically driven. They felt like they didn't want to burden their children with reactor waste. Some of the things that are unique about I just want to give you a flavor of some of the things that went into the German program that made it work. Enlightened politicians, top of the list. It's a critical thing. Scientific analysis used as a basis for developing the renewable energy plan. In 2000, they asked the German scientific community, I mentioned this last night, those of you that were there, they said, what is the potential for renewable energy in Germany? The scientists said 100%. Everything in Germany could be run on renewable energy. That is the governing premise of all their national energy decisions now, is it can all be done renewably. Let's get there as intelligently as we can. Government's energy efficiency policies, they're strict. They're the government. They work in the public interest, which is sometimes shocking to us in the United States. They pass laws. They increase taxes on oil and gas and electricity. It makes people use it more efficiently. It reduces greenhouse gas emissions. It also is very good for the economy in general because you're able to produce similar products with less energy input, less cost, and you can market your products for less. We talked about the commitment with nuclear power. Another key thing, it's a long-term commitment. In the United States, the wind production tax credit, which is critical to siting wind plants, it's a federal, they keep letting it expire, or they give this begrudging thing of a year or two. Germany, they've got plans that are going out 20, 25 years. You need, especially for utility level planning, you need a minimum of 15 years so that they can plan. And you have to have that time horizon so that they can aggressively invest. So that's what's going on in terms of our organization, what we're doing right now. This is a way that you can get involved. We have this 4 climate change questions for Congress campaign going on right now. Go to our website, send them off to our congressional representatives here. It's 4 questions that kind of focus, make them take a stand on this great threat, and send them to your friends around the United States. Thank you very much, and look forward to our conversation.
You're supposed to introduce our extra man.
Okay, is Matt here? Matt Leo from Montperg is going to join us up front and probably be able to shed some things on the state issues.
Come on up.
While they all are doing that, I'm going to pass out 3x5 cards and pencils. Each of you should have 1 card and 1 pencil, and then you'll get some questions asked, to which you write down the answer.
Keep the lights up.
I would keep them down. Well, you can put them up for a little while, but I will need them down again shortly. I need to get back to this screen now. Jack, how about comparing, do you agree with David and his
Well, it's
his...
very optimistic, and you have to go into details. I'm not going to.
Well, okay. Well, I have to do it then. All right. You want to say something? Would you like to start off?
Yeah, sure thing. So again, my name is Matt Leo. I'm the executive director of the Montana Public Interest Research Group, MontPIRG. And as far as energy policy in the state goes, things that I've been directly involved with, last legislative session earlier this year, we passed a renewable energy standard for Montana, which will require the utilities in our state to get 15% of their supply from renewable resources. Of course, that's modest, and it's just a start, but it's definitely exciting because it helps spur investment in the industry. As David was talking about earlier, Pat Judge quoted him a number of approximately twice as much to cite a wind farm. What that doesn't take into account, though, is that the wind farm doesn't have a fuel cost, whereas the coal plant does. So over time, the wind farm is competitive. It's the upfront capital investment that makes it not as competitive as far as investors go. So when you create this market demand through a renewable energy standard requiring the utilities to purchase this power, then you spur the investment. So we're starting to see that now. There's a wind farm at Judith Gap that's actually going to supply 7% of Northwestern Energy's electricity demand, and that's a really exciting start. Of course, that's about half of what Northwestern's going to have to do between now and 2015, so it'll just be interesting to see how this plays out. On the negative side, I'm sure everybody here has heard a lot of this talk about clean coal. This really concerns me a lot because, first of all, clean coal technology, although it can include carbon sequestration, unless the government requires it, it obviously costs more money, and there's no promise that any of this coal development is going to include carbon sequestration. I think the other danger is that as far as public perception of coal energy goes, I think people really understand that coal is dirty, causes air pollution. People have, in some ways, a lot of people have a negative perception of what coal is about and the impacts of it. However, when we start to talk about a clean coal, Governor Schweitzer's out there touting clean coal, I think we start to greenwash coal. People might not understand the difference between a traditional pulverized coal plant and a modern so-called clean coal plant that actually doesn't burn the coal but refines it, turns it into syngas. I don't want to get into the technical aspects of it. But anyhow, as far as just the image of the industry goes, I think just all this talk about clean coal is helping to improve the industry's image, which is a dangerous thing that we see going on. Another area that MontPIRG is working on in energy field is working on requiring the power plants in our state to reduce their mercury pollution. Coal-fired power plants are the leading source of mercury pollution both in Montana and nationally. And as far as where this plays into energy policy and global warming, it's about costs. And the costs of coal, I would say, are artificially low. And if these guys had to actually pay for the full cost of their energy production, instead of being able to externalize them and harm people's health, harm the environment, destroy our fisheries, cause children to be born with mental retardation, autism, causing people to have heart attacks and the medical bills associated with those. If they have to actually pay the cost of preventing the mercury pollution, yes, we will see some increased costs to consumers, but I would say that's a good thing. We should pay more for coal. I would like to see the cost of coal power go up, or at least reflect the actual costs of its production. So, instead of it being externalized and us having to pay for it through other ways, I'd like to see the price tag actually applied to the power that's being produced. So those are the things that we're working on. Do I need to pass the mic? Do you have your own mic? Or?
I'll take it.
Okay.
Actually, I don't need the mic. I've got my own here, don't I? Well, I was listening to David and thinking, the last couple of days, Jack and I have been walking around mournfully thinking, we've dug ourselves into a deep hole, and I don't know how we're going to get out of it. But listening to David sounds as if it's a snap. It should be really easy. I've been looking at the web quite a lot lately, trying to understand where all of these things. And, there's a wide spectrum of groups who have something to say about all of these questions of energy policy and the way out of it and the technologies that are present. And they're all highly technical questions. And invariably, from one extreme to the other, from the people who are ecstatic about the coming new technologies, the technological fixes that are going to get us out of this, to the folks on the other end, who I suspect Dave is closer to, they are all very enthusiastic that their way is going to do it. And I don't know, because I haven't spent a lot of my time looking into these technologies and comparing. But, for example, on the environmental side, there are some very large coalitions of literally dozens of the major environmental organizations that you know about in the United States. Groups like the Sierra Club, like the World Wildlife Fund, like the Environmental Defense Fund, and so on. And they all have something to say. And then there are groups on the other side as well. Just a couple of days ago, or a week or so ago, the World Wildlife Fund came out with a report based on a study that they had conducted for them. And this was in late October. And the heading on this particular article is, "The EU is going to fail Kyoto." And this is based on a study that was made of just 6 of the countries, the 6 major countries in the EU, that the ones that are producing about 70% of the total emissions, and Germany is the biggest of these. And what this is saying is that the targets for CO2 reduction in these countries overall is inadequate to meet the goals of Kyoto, and that there is a lack of fairness between the countries and sectors, with some countries making much greater efforts to reduce CO2 than the others. And they propose policy changes which they say could actually lead to a 1/3 reduction in current emissions by that year of 2020 or 2025. But which is a lot smaller than what this figure that goes back to 1990. So I'm really puzzled at the varying estimates that are coming from all of these different quarters. It seems to me, if now that it is the case that because of the cost increases in many of the fossil fuel sources, that renewable resources are, in one sense, competitive. That is, price-wise up front, they may be competitive. It is certainly true that shifting the subsidies from the fossil fuels to the renewables would help the renewables very much. It is also true that in both cases, it seems likely that neither would get very far without subsidies. For example, WorldWatch, which has been involved in this and is part of a coalition called the Energy Futures Group. I was going to show you, in fact, if I had time, a series of transparencies from Chris Flavin, who is the head of WorldWatch, about where it has gone and where we are now and what the possibilities are. However, he's much less optimistic than the view that Dave Merritt has been giving us just now. And I don't know who's right or who's wrong, but it seems to me that unless we are willing to look at these things objectively and recognize that when we're talking about highly technical questions and economic questions, that there are going to be a lot of views, and the layperson can't easily sort them out. That's one thing we have to worry about. Another thing that we have to worry about is the fact that that we must bring aboard countries like China. And it isn't just the United States. This coalition of the willing that the United States has assembled, none of whom want to see any kind of caps on their energy production include countries like China and India that are going to rely very heavily on coal, because for them that is very much the cheapest thing to do. Why should they not take the cheapest method unless there is a reason? And if they don't accept the reason of climate change, then they don't have a reason to change. Bringing them into the process is absolutely essential if that isn't to be the future that we find. So even though Tony Blair, of course, isn't as popular in the United States as he was because he's gone along with Bush in the war, I think that he is a realist politically, and I think that the points that he made are sound, and that there are things we can't ignore if we're going to do anything substantial about this on a worldwide basis.
Are you saying from that article that Germany is not going to meet its Kyoto targets? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying it. That's what World Wildlife Fund says. And they say that they could reach the Kyoto targets, but the Kyoto targets are nothing like the 60% reduction from 1990 levels.
Right, but they've publicly said that they're on target to reduce 40% by 2020.
So which one do we believe?
Well, I don't know.
I don't know. That's the problem. And the political problem hangs over it all, and I do think we have to solve that.
Well, I mean, personally, I think that the best way to get China involved, the thing that they would respond to is if we ratified Kyoto.
I think we have to go beyond Kyoto. In fact, a number of the conservation organizations have been saying we've got to speed it up and intensify it.
Well, that's not opposite of what I'm saying. I'm saying we need to ratify Kyoto, and at this late date, we'd have to start aggressively reducing emissions, which is what is needed. And then for the next round, we should come up with much more aggressive targets. The U.S. is holding up everything, including China. Why should they get involved if we're not willing to? That's, you know,
I think that's
kind
true.
of what it comes down to.
I think that is true, but making it happen is the issue. Jack, what do you have to say?
Well, not on this particular point, but I have a feeling that the general public is not representative here. I have a feeling the general public is more concerned with how many dollars it takes to fill up their SUV than they are the amount of CO2 that we're putting in the atmosphere. I feel a tremendous gulf between these people, and I'd like some response from you gentlemen on how we can, what kind of public relations or what kinds of things can we do to overcome this gulf?
The first thing that comes to mind isn't actually public relations, but it's just public policy. I mean, having artificially low prices for fossil fuels because of government subsidies, I think is a good place to start. I mean, people are going to go with the cheapest option, absolutely. And I think it's really hard to get the majority of people to pay more for something because of some ethical position that they have. I mean, I think a lot of people in this room make such choices, but to expect the majority to, I think that's difficult. So I think where we really need to start is having the price of these fuels reflect the actual cost to society and the actual cost of production, and stop subsidizing them.
I think one thing we need, regarding your question, Jack, is that we don't need even 51% of people to cause an energy revolution in the United States. 10 years into the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King was asked in an interview how many black Americans had participated in even one demonstration. He said, no more than 10%. So this is no more than 10% of the aggrieved racial group in the United States caused a revolution in civil rights. And in 1950, across most of the South, most people said this will never change. Just like they said before the Civil War, this will never change. Just like before they pulled down the wall, this will never come down. Just like the Cold War will never end. There are so many examples, or how Gandhi would get rid of the British without violence. There's so many examples where people looked at a problem and came together. If we have small percentages of the United States come together in a very bold program, things will happen. Our organization is trying to do that. We've been very public about very bold policies. We have groups all over the country that have joined on. No one has ever, and we've consulted with top energy experts, no one has ever said that this aggressive program is impossible. Some people have doubted it, but no one has ever laid out and said, this is why it won't work. So, and it's what we need. So I think that we need to not get too discouraged thinking that we're going to have to convince all those people that are just worried about money. They're going to benefit from whatever public policies, visionary public policies can, and it may just be up to small numbers of people that are organized and pushing really hard.
I hope you're right.
David, do you see a way that Montana may ratify the Kyoto Treaty or some form of it to reduce these emissions and make us more...
Missoula has joined the cities that have agreed to, in a non-binding way, reduce the greenhouse gas emissions according to the Kyoto reductions, which for the United States is 5%. So Missoula has joined that. I think it's about 160 cities that have joined around the country, including a lot of really big cities. Seattle, the mayor in Seattle led that. So that's a good thing that Missoula has joined that. But, you know, it's not even a binding thing. It's really, it's a difficult, you know, we're pretty far from where we need to be. But that's a positive step anyway.
We'll take some more questions in a minute, but we're going to pause now, and you're going to get a chance to answer these questions, and then we're going to see what you all think.
Okay.
You all have a card and a pencil.
So what we would like you to do is to, as we bring each of these up, perhaps give a show of hands so we have an idea, so we all have an idea of how people feel, and then fill out that question on the card. All you need to do is put down the numbers. There are 7 questions, and then which of your answers, A, B, C, or whatever, and then later we'll be able to tabulate them and give you an exact answer for how everybody feels. These questions were made up in advance of the discussion, so I'm not sure how close they'll come. Here's the first one. Considering global warming, what is the role of greenhouse gases? Do you think, A, that they have been proven to be the principal cause, or B, that they probably are, or C, that they probably are not the principal cause of this? What do you all think? So let's see, how many think A, for example, that it is the cause and it is definitely settled? How many think that is with high probability it is, but that it isn't definite? Only a couple people think that. That's what I think. And I also think that that's all we need. You know, we've had all of these years in which our government and other governments have said we must have absolute proof. You don't have to have absolute proof of something that is... I know that I was on the radio the other morning on a talk show, and people were questioning. They weren't so sure it was true because they said, well, not so long ago we were hearing that the climate was going to go down, we were going to go into an ice age. How do we know that we should take this seriously? My answer is it's the insurance principle. If there's a very high probability of something, or even a moderate probability that something is very severe that could happen, then you shouldn't ignore it. You should do some things to deal with it. My wife Mavis suggests this analogy. You know, if an asteroid is coming toward the Earth and is likely to hit us, and we have the ability to use put a rocket out there and kind of nudge it off the path the way we nudge the icebergs from the channel on the way to Newfoundland with tugboats. We're not sure that we're that we need to do that, but it would be so horrendous if it happened that we go ahead and we move it out, and maybe we didn't need to, but we saved the possibility of a major disaster. And that's why I would come down in the middle. Is there anybody here who thinks it is not the major cause? There are a great many people in the world who do think that. Next question. What about this treaty of capping the CO2 emissions of the signatories? Should we sign that? I guess we've all up here said in one way or another that we should. Jack? We should sign it. And David thinks certainly, and we should particularly sign the Kyoto protocols, is the general impression. I say we should at least do that. But what do you think? How many of you say we should? Or that we should not? And anybody who's still bewildered on this question? I guess not. Next, how about these caps and the market feature part that I tried to describe, so that there's a price for rights? That is, this trading principle. I know that a lot of people do not like the idea of trades. They think it is somehow immoral. They think that it has to do with allowing people to pollute. And I don't know how many people here might feel that, but I know there are a lot of people outside who do. So how many would say, yes, we should do this? And that's not the majority by any means. How many say we should not? Including my wife down there, and Jack's wife. And how many here admit they're not sure? Okay. I think this is a crucial point, and that it's one that sooner or later we need to clarify. Next, this is a local question about coal. How many think that we should go ahead on the synfuel process, which liquefies coal and uses it for oil, and therefore would be a substitute for imported oil? As long as we are continuing to use oil to make gasoline, here would be a substitute way of doing it, which would not require us to use imported oil. How many think that we should do that? And nobody wants to do that. How about this second alternative, the electric power production using sequestration of CO2? This is an idea that a lot of people I've talked to who are environmentalists think is the coming thing. That is, you pump the carbon dioxide under the ground or otherwise get rid of it so it doesn't enter the atmosphere. You may perhaps turn it into a solid with calcium carbonate or something like that. How many would favor doing that at this time? There are a few. Who would want to do both? And how many would want to do neither? Okay. My personal view is that the technology isn't proved, so moving ahead now would be a mistake, but maybe down the line things would change. What about coal bed methane production? You know that Wyoming makes a lot of money from coal bed methane. Should we do it because A, it is a relatively low carbon emitter compared to coal? How many think that? Should we do it provided the EPA drinking water safeguards are restored? Would that be a reason to do it? Nobody thinks that. So then the answer for everyone is no? Or maybe I don't know. Okay. We're getting to the end. Well, now, suppose the situation is as bad as I think it is, that it's going to be as hard as I think it may be to get out of this situation we're in, and that we have to make some major changes, not just some little things around the fringes. Well, to what extent do you think that might be true so that you would be willing to vote for dropping the speed on the interstates around the country down to 55 miles an hour next year? How many of you are ready to do that?
45.
You would even go, well, you can, of course, go further, lower if you want.
These are the radicals.
So this is yes, gladly bunch. How about the yes, reluctantly group? I mean, it wouldn't be fun, right? But maybe you better do it anyhow, yeah? And how many think no, that it's not an important thing to do? There are a couple here.
One other. Massively increased cafe standards as opposed to that.
Yeah, we had thought of putting these alternatives, and yes, obviously the cafe standards is the biggest thing we
That's
could
the
do
one that-
with automobiles. You're absolutely right. Okay, well we're down near the bottom here. Well, okay, suppose it means that this whole structure of society that we have is inadequate to do the job, and that we're going to have to make major changes, not just fix up our house so that it doesn't use so much electric power, but stop living in dispersed subdivisions and live in cities that are like a lot of European cities, like Rome, for example, where many people live in flats in large apartment buildings. Would you, and there are parks near them, would you be willing to do that? Are you willing to consider that? And if so, would you do it gladly is the first question. Would anybody do it and be glad to do it?
Four-story.
It's actually rather nice living in those cities and even in higher, I've done it. How about yes, but again, reluctantly? You really, of course, we all like living where we live. And those who would say no, don't do it. Okay, I think that's the last one. Yes. So at this point, remarks and comments from the floor here, from all of you out there.
I just want to make a quick comment. In the late 30s, early 40s, the United States had the best mass transit system in the world with our trolleys and light rail systems. And there was a conspiracy during that time to get rid of all the trolleys. It was General Motors, Firestone, and Standard Oil, which they did overnight. And so that was causing all the problems today. Now we have the worst.
The Brits had a marvelous rail system back in Edwardian days. It's been downhill ever since. Even there, and of course we're worse.
Quick question, isn't GM the one who makes the Hummer?
Yeah.
Good.
You want to recognize people?
In terms of like this movement that we're talking about here, like
You have to speak up.
in terms of this movement that we're talking about here, how does it compare with like the civil rights movement or what Gandhi did? Like, does anybody know what's actually going on in this country and where everything's at?
Yeah.
Like, what kind of
It's certainly nowhere near what the civil rights movement became at its peak, which is what most people remember. But there's a tremendous amount of ferment going on. There's a lot of little things going on, and I would say it seems like it's getting bigger every week now. There's a lot of activity. There's going to be a lot of actions on December 3rd to coincide with the Montreal meeting. And it's not just the global warming piece, it's this whole big thing with renewable energy. And this involves industry.
We started
and everything.
15 minutes
So
late.
it seems like, I watch this really closely, it seems like now it's getting bigger every week. And I think that that's only going to continue indefinitely. And that's a really good thing for us, but the impacts are growing too. So that's what
So we'll have a few more questions. If you have to go, would you leave your answers and your pencils in the front? Those are cute little pencils, but please don't take them. Other questions or comments?
Did anyone happen to see C-SPAN 2 at noon today? They were covering the Senate floor, and the chairman of the Environment Committee for the Senate was speaking, James Inhofe, about global climate change, explaining what a bogus story it is, explaining how the scientists who talk about global climate change have been politicized and so forth. Any talk about change
Enough. I missed it. Was it enough that you were talking about?
You know,
Yeah.
Well, you don't need this. Anybody else?
I mean, I can just.
You can hand it
You
around.
want me to use
allow
it?
it, please.
Okay, just this
Please
mic.
use the handheld.
Oh, use the handle. Okay.
Do you want us all to do that?
This is the guy that said global warming is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. He's a fossil. I mean, just go around it. I mean, there's no way that if there's an organized grassroots movement, this primitive person is going to stop it. The only reason he gets away with that is because the people in his district like him. He's only one person. And what we're talking about, if we have any hope of addressing global warming, is some kind of revolution. It really is. There's going to have to be a tremendous amount of organized, very, very pushy activity, very much like the civil rights movement.
It's kind of a comment. The whole theory of increasing the cost of fuel, which very appropriately from any kind of an economic perspective is a reasonable idea, is also one that people have fought at every single level. And having worked in the alternative energy industry during the Carter years, when in Colorado there were 70% tax credits for wind and alternative energy installation, what I found then and what I've seen since is that if you can figure out a way to monetize the benefit of whatever change you're trying to create and then distribute that to people rather than creating something that they see as a penalty, giving them a economic benefit for creating the change that you need, it's much easier to get people on board. One example of that is to offer a $3,000 payment to take a gas guzzler off the road. You know, your car is 9 years old, it's a gas guzzler, you get $3,000 as opposed to probably the $1,000 you get for reselling it otherwise, for taking it off and then of course putting that money into a more efficient car. That framework seems to work a lot better in terms of enrolling people than creating economic disincentives, though the reality is that you're probably doing the same thing but you're putting a different framework on it, but it works a lot more effectively to do one rather than the other. To the extent that we can do that, we're going to get people a lot more enthusiastic about climbing on board.
The thing I'm concerned about is that people are paying extra. They just don't know it.
Yeah.
They don't know that they're paying it through their taxes. And so we do need to inform the public about that end of things, and I'd like to see that addressed.
4 minutes.
Are we running out of time here?
We've got another 4 minutes.
I just want to say something really quickly. There's a very interesting development in Colorado happened about 2 weeks ago. The people that had purchased wind electricity ended up paying less than their next door neighbors who had chosen fossil fuels. That's the wave of the future, and it happened and affected pocketbooks in Colorado last week, including my sister.
Well, you know, if it is actually cheaper to do these things, it'll happen, and you won't have to do any work for any organizations. It'll just happen.
You promise, Bob?
Do you promise that it's really true, though?
About what's true?
That it is advantageous economically for individuals to go to the renewables instead of to use fossil fuels.
No, in most cases it's not. I was just saying that for the first time that in a mass market, the wind and electricity was cheaper, which is the beginning of a trend.
Yeah, it's true that the wind energy is now comparable, but it's mostly because of the price of some of the fossil fuels having gone up. And if we started using coal in a big way, that would be cheap. It would be dirty, but it would be cheap. And there is, it seems to me, one possible and very likely scenario for the future is that we won't be willing to give up anything significant. We won't be willing to move into those apartment buildings. And in the end, we won't do anything until we've used up most of the fossil fuel that's out there. That is, if we don't burn ourselves up in the process.
A question back there and a question there, and then we'll follow this.
Yeah, I have a comment and question. Just one comment. comment is that the Department of Transportation has just started a study on Highway 93, and they are looking at adding lanes to Highway 93, making it a 6-lane highway. But they've also said that they're realizing they can't build out their way out of congestion, and that they're going to have to look at trains and buses and other modes. I think there's an opportunity. My question relates to what you just said. A statistic I just read was that we've used about 1 trillion barrels of oil in the past. There's about another trillion, the harder to get trillion. What's the fate of that 1 trillion barrels of oil? Even if we move to renewables, are we destined to burn that up? Should we be looking at using it for plastics and solidifying it? What do we look at over time we use it so it's not all released into the atmosphere? Have you all thought, maybe David, about is there a sustainable use for the last or the second half of the oil that's left in the world?
Well, as much as possible, it should be left in the ground. And it definitely has, because of those long chain molecules, it's superb materials for creating plastics and all kinds of incredible things, pharmaceuticals. So that's a much higher use than just burning it. But I mean, as far as how much that'll get used, this is all in play right now. And it really depends on what we're doing. I think that the peak in global oil production is a very interesting wrinkle, because now, in addition to the climate threats, in addition to just basic energy prices, there is very reasoned voices in the petroleum industry even that are saying we're headed possibly for a peak that may have happened last week. It could happen in 2 months, 5 years, but we are not at all ready to go to $100 a barrel oil and have it stay there. So all of a sudden it's like it's just another reason to run to renewables as fast as possible and to use energy much more efficiently.
I agree, though, especially with natural gas. There's a reason to have some left after we burn it, and that is the production of fertilizers. The Green Revolution is based on natural gas, and it would be a shame to see that go. People would go hungry.
I think if you look at Lester Brown's work, you'll find it's a lot more than people going hungry. With the world demand for food, and a 20, 30-year projection that if we don't create huge amounts of energy, either alternatives or however, we're going to see millions, if not billions, of people starving on the planet, and the economic and social dislocation that is beyond comprehension.
The gentleman mentioned about taxing gas-guzzler cars, which is a great idea. How can people on a grassroots level to get incentives to make lifestyle changes? I mean, you can hang your clothes outside instead of using your dryer. You can wash your dishes instead of using your dishwasher, things like that. There should be some incentives at the lower level to get things moving, to get people's ideas in their heads, and then just keep growing from there.
Think of all the years in which people attempted to get a tax on gasoline as a way of persuading people to lessen their gasoline use and have smaller cars and so on, and nothing ever came of that. That comes back to the idea of people don't like sticks as much as they like carrots. Are we finished?
I think we're done. I'd like to thank the panelists, and I'd like to thank you all for being here.